Welcome to Understandable Insights, Information to Intelligence with Sue Gordon, the national security podcast that provides you an elemental understanding of the world as it is, not how you prefer it to be. I'm Eric, joined each week by the Honorable Sue Gordon, and together we'll break down the headlines shaping our world and ask how we should be thinking and acting as citizens and leaders across issues in intelligence, technology, and business. It's September 15th, 2025. Let's get to it. Hey, Sue, how are you?
I'm good, Eric. September 15th, halfway through the month.
That's right.
Wondering whether there's going to be a shutdown
Yeah,
in the
end of
government.
the fiscal year.
Yeah, I've told you about my plan for that, right?
No, what you got?
My plan is if the Congress doesn't pass a budget annually
Okay.
by the 30th of September, we dismiss every member and every state sends us somebody new. It's their
Yeah,
one
that's right.
job. I think it would only take you once. I don't know that a lot of harm would be, would be suffered by us, but this is just ridiculous, right? I mean, every company knows if you can't plan, you can't do. So, what'd you do this weekend?
Took a trip out to America's finest city, San Diego, California, for a college buddy's wedding. It was awesome. It was great seeing everybody. Took the youngest member, his first trip to California, and it was a lot of fun. So maybe a little bit of extra gravel in my voice from some debauchery, but we're recovering.
Sounds good.
How about you?
Well, since our listeners, watchers are kind of part of my journey as well, it turns out that 30 minutes after we finished recording our podcast last Monday, I was, for the second time in 3 months, rushed to the hospital in crisis. And I'm sitting here, patched up, put back together. But it does prompt me to have to say something about medicine and doctors. I also feel the other side of medicine, the insurance system, and just the whole structure that works around it. But doctors and providers have been taking a lot of strays from all fronts, and most especially my candidate for the most dangerous and worst cabinet secretary we have, and that's RFK Jr., because I just think you and I talk about national security being fundamentally about the humans we have and their safety, and I think he's putting those at risk. But along the way, with whatever agenda he's advancing, he's also suggesting that the practitioners are somehow motivated by something other than health. I will tell you, I'm sure the hospital made money from my stay. I'm sure the pharmaceutical companies made money from all the drugs that they gave me trying to figure out what in the world was going on. But there wasn't 1 second of one day that the medical staff wasn't trying to serve me. And I think the second thing that I just was reminded again is that there isn't an equation that these people are solving. Like, I've now presented with 2 situations that really were difficult to understand. And they stood there looking at me, trying to figure out how to save me and making decisions before the answer was in evidence. And I just don't think we talk enough about those humans that are in the fray with us. And again, I have opinions about the medical establishment, but let's be clear. I don't think I've ever been more confident that the people who are there in the room with you are there in the room for you.
Yeah, we're very grateful for those folks that were able to take care of you, and glad to have you here because we need you on that wall.
Yeah.
And it's tough because the operators at the front line, right, the warfighters, if you will, they don't get a lot of that recognition. And so I think it's really important that you call it out. And then last night at the Emmys, The Pit, I don't know if you've seen that show on HBO, pretty good, very well regarded in our family. They won 5 Emmys, Best Drama Series. Noah Wiley won the award for Best Actor in a Drama. And then the charge nurse, Catherine Lanasa, she won for Best Supporting Actress in a Drama. So
Yeah,
cool
totally.
to see them get some recognition. And it does a really good job of highlighting some of that and some of the difficult job that those practitioners do have.
Yeah, that moment where there's a human who's come in and they're looking at it like, what is this?
Yeah.
And just massive gratitude. So for everyone at Del Seaton and for Kim and Beth and the whole team, thank you.
Nice. All right. Let's get to some headlines. So this week in the threat picture, we'll take a romp around the world. Russian drones pierced Poland, accident or a NATO stress test. And Israel strikes inside Qatar, justifiable preemption or a sovereignty violation. Australia buys Angel's Ghost Shark AI subs, deterrence you can deploy now. A report from the Associated Press, American tech companies helped build Beijing's digital dragnet and police state. Export control failures and who is responsible. Finally, FBI Chief Kash Patel to go before the Senate Judiciary Committee this week. We'll ask what's wrong with leading from the podium during a crisis.
Wow.
So, Sue, we'll start with this geopolitics romp. Did it a couple weeks ago, and I think it's time for a new update. A couple of the areas I specifically wanted to get your take on were the high-stakes drone incursion into Polish airspace by Russia. Poland says its skies were violated 19 times, with officials across Europe calling the move a deliberate provocation designed to probe Western resolve. Was this a mistake, as claimed by the Russians, or probing? And then the other one was in the Gulf. So Israel conducted a targeted strike inside Qatari territory, citing credible threats from Iranian-backed militants. Israel says it acted preemptively, but Qatar and others are furious, calling it a breach of sovereignty. Secretary of State Marco Rubio was in Israel over the weekend, and Monday, Qatar is hosting an emergency summit of Arab and Muslim heads of state.
Yeah. Let's start with Russia, Ukraine, which is, I think, what the drone incursion into Poland is really about. I think the president, by his actions, has made it clear that either he's unwilling to or unable to influence Putin to come to the table meaningfully. I think Putin feels like he holds, I can't believe I'm going to use the word holds all the cards, but I think he does. And it's hard to look at the past, how long, many months of this administration to see that it's been escalating, right? Not only the attacks in Ukraine, but now this. So I think the biggest thing is this is a hot war. Putin has objectives. I think the chances of it being a mistake are vanishingly small. I suppose you could get there where you could have someone put it in the wrong coordinates. If it were really a mistake, you would expect a call from leader A to leader B.
Right.
There's no evidence that happens. So I think that's, yeah, a dodge. I don't think it's good. I mean, to have no meaningful counter, I guess I take away from it that NATO and Europe actually have been, in the wake of U.S. non-leadership, have been, in fact, coming together. Zelensky and Ukraine are getting stronger, maybe buoyed by the support they're getting from Europe and the commitments there. But absolutely, this is a message. Absolutely, it's a message that I think some other drones came in to Ukraine via Belarusian airspace, which is, again, another element of tacit support and complicity for Russia, which is one of the things you expect to have happening, because if he's gonna be the winner, people are gonna decide to align with him. I think there are a lot of similarities between this and South China Sea and what China does with Taiwan.
Yeah.
They first would steam through the Taiwan Straits, and then they'd do overflights over it, and you're just softening for the day will come where we're just gonna do what we want, and you've let us come this far, how are you gonna stop it? I think what's interesting about it is I would have expected, since Poland is such a strong ally, I think I would have expected a little bit stronger reaction from the president, but I think more just kind of viewed in the global sense of, this isn't going anywhere. Now, Trump's suggestion that he'll go tougher on sanctions if NATO goes stronger on sanctions. You and I are going to have a guest coming on soon that can help us with just kind of sanctions, crypto, and a number of things about this. But I will say,
Yeah.
there are different realities for different countries based on their situation. So to expect all European nations to basically not need Russian oil in the absence of another plan for them to get their energy supplies, I think it's a nice soundbite to say. But if you just look at our tariff strategy, we make concessions all the time based on things we can't afford. So it's like we're tepidly still engaged, but if you just look at the trend over the last few months, Russia's making the advance, and we seemed more unwilling to stop them. Do you see it differently?
No, I just wonder, like, how many more sanctions are available, like you said. I view it as a probe, 100%.
Oh,
I
100.
don't think it was an accident. I think it was testing their defenses, testing the reaction time,
Yep.
and at a minimum, establishing that normalcy, that baseline normalization of it.
Yeah, it was an ops test for sure. I think we'll find out that there are sanctions, but you have to, well, let's just look at the agreement with India, the discussion over tariffs there, where we kind of backed off on the kinds of things that we could have done to Russia via that set of sanctions by getting India not to
Right.
buy things. And again, I don't know that we'll talk about it here, but the US is standing in the world in terms of being a trusted partner. We're going to see the impact of that over time as when we seem untrustworthy, there our partners and allies' willingness to do hard things on our say so, I think is going to be diminished, and I think
Yeah.
to not overall good effect.
Well, what about the Qataris?
Yeah, they knew what was going on at the time. They knew that there were peace talks going on. It sure doesn't feel peaceful in the Middle East right now.
Right.
It doesn't feel like Netanyahu is tempering any of his objectives on any fronts. We haven't talked about Gaza in a while, but I put that in. It's a great story. We gotta go after the bad guys and get them what they are. But to do so, if it was unannounced in Qatar, at a time that they're trying to have peace talks, it just feels like a breach of sovereignty. And
Yeah.
again, over the course of my career, leaders do talk to each other even when they're doing hard things. So it feels provocative. It feels destructive. Taking Hamas off the table, I think, is a good thing to do in general because they are a very malign actor. And, trust is gonna be a theme today, but if you breach trust.
And because they didn't notify anybody ahead of
Right.
time. Like, I think the Qataris discovered 10 minutes after the attack from us because we didn't know about it. CENTCOM was like, "What are these jets doing? Why are they flying
Right.
around here?" And it's been a normalization thing too. That was the counter from Iran's attack after the bombing of the nuclear facilities with the
Yep.
V2s. They said, "Hey, we're going to
Yep.
strike in Qatar. We're going to strike the major base at Al Udeid." That's advance warning, though, compared to the Israelis are just doing their own thing.
And if you go backwards even a decade with Russia, our relationship is so strained with them now, but counterterrorism operations, we would
Yeah, in
often
Syria, right?
coordinate,
Yeah.
right? We'd coordinate who is in what airspace doing what. So this idea that you couldn't have shared your planned operation suggests that your motivation is different from combined security in the region. I'm not a fan of what seems to be happening on globally, which is I can do whatever I want.
Yeah.
And maybe it's an effective strategy because our norms have been so eroded that we don't know what the right response is. I think this is an area where US leadership is really, or the absence of US global leadership is really showing.
Yeah.
Because this would have been the sort of thing that you would have had people going and say, "Knock it off."
Yeah.
Right, here, let's get to the larger play.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't look into whether there's anything in the Abraham Accords, which actually I considered one of the successes of the first Trump administration, whether this contravened any of that. I just don't know. I didn't look it up. We'll get back next week on that.
What about in the global south? Looking at Brazil, just finding former President Bolsonaro guilty in those charges of leading an insurrection.
Yeah, it's Brazil's business. The current duly elected president suffered through an attack on the court and the Congress because Bolsonaro's supporters didn't like the outcome of an election. It feels common, but in this case, Brazil came to a resolution and decided through their legal processes to hold him accountable. I think Brazil should care about that, and we'll have to work through it in terms of what it means. The introduction of the US and having an opinion about that, or in my estimation, worse, tethering it to tariffs or other things based on what countries do for themselves. China is all over the global south in terms of building relationships, trade. When we start being a problem for nations, they do have other people to turn to for trade and relationships. And again, those trade and relationships over the course of time are one of the great stabilizers in in the world. So the idea that over something that seems like Brazilian internal politics and the US suggesting that because it doesn't like that outcome, we will put more economic pain on Brazil feels like it is unlikely to be successful in terms of shaping what Brazil does, go sovereignty, and has the potential to force an ally into the hands of a competitor. Again, I do not see that there's either a 3 or a 4D chessboard going on here. Like a bunch of indiscriminate actions that feel good to us to achieve, to make some statement about something that we feel. So,
Yeah,
uh,
quit messing with my coffee prices. It's their sovereignty issue. And
right.
Lula's no choir boy himself,
Oh,
like the current president. He spent his time in jail for some corruption charges and things. But at the end of the day, this is the Brazilian
yeah, I'm
government's
not choosing a
decision, right?
side.
Yeah.
I'm not choosing a side. I'm also not the election monitor in Brazil to know whether Bolsonaro's supporters have something to say.
Yeah.
They've resolved it, and they've resolved it in a legal way. It just doesn't feel like that's our thing. I guess we can decide that we don't want to do things with them. Staying in the global south, what are we doing with Venezuela?
Reports that the vote was turning around or changed course.
I think that's gonna turn out to be a black eye. Now, with the control that the president has over all the arms of government, I'm not sure that anything really happens with that. But again, this "I can do it because I want to" just isn't a great thing. I go back on the trust thing. In the US, we're not choir people either. But I think for the longest time, the world has been really able to rely on us to be governed by a set of norms and standards, rule of law, engagement with adversaries and competitors and allies in a way that is trustworthy. So that I think will just turn out to be something that ought to be a great lesson learned and then result in some policy changes. But just what are we doing with Venezuela in general, sending warships? And did I see that there were F-35s in Puerto Rico?
Yep.
So what's our plan? Right? Are we gonna invade Venezuela over drugs? I'm a career intelligence officer. I've seen us trying to do something about drugs for a long time. This is a really
Hmm.
difficult problem, and one of the biggest problems that we contribute is just how much of a consumer we are of the drugs these people produce if we weren't consuming. But regime change? Oh my gosh, I just remember a minute ago where this administration was talking about the folly of regime change. Look at the Middle East, for goodness sake. So what are we doing? And Eric, I just like your perspective on this. We're putting women and men in harm's way. Whether you're doing a training exercise or whether you're actually engaged in some sort of armed combat, there's a cost, and not just financial to these. I think it's really unclear what our plan is. I think this is one of the ways where just the failure of Congress to uphold its responsibilities to be able to have hearings and conversations on this before we go into these conflicts, before we spend money on these things, to have conversations about what it is we think we're doing. And again, with the American people, right? Because these things all cost. So I hear the words that we're saying about the Maduro regime is terrible. Conditions you've taken over the course of the past 20 years. You've taken one of the most amazing countries, incredibly rich in terms of their natural resources, and you've made it a mess. But is it really ours to go in and do something about that? And if we are, what's the plan? And it can't just be encircling it and shooting down boats of questionable origin.
No, absolutely. And it's decidedly more than a training exercise, right? That's what
Yeah.
Secawar has come out and said. And I think we talked about this a lot last week, and he had some good opinions on it. Hopefully, this results in Maduro and Venezuela picking up more of the bag.
Yeah.
They talked about doing some more response on narco terrorism and narcotics. But yeah, it comes down to the demand signal. And that was the war on drugs, what,
Forever.
40 years ago, was trying to stop it at the demand side.
And Eric, I'm just not sure, even if it's trying to put pressure on Maduro to come more to the table, again, take the last 9 months. What promises, what path have we committed to that anyone can count on, even if we start down that path and they start to
Yeah.
trust us, that it won't change in the middle
Yeah.
if it doesn't work. So again, that's just one that I'm not sure I understand. And I guess the last thing I'll say on kind of our rompy, it's not enough to have a soundbite. It's not enough to decide on a thing you wanna do. And this actually has been one of my criticisms of this administration when I was part of it the first time is second and third order effects, gang. Like, I get it. That feels good. I get it. We ought to stop what's going on in Venezuela from the drug trade. I get it. But what's the plan and how do you sustain that and how is it gonna achieve outcome?
Right.
We'll get to talking about this, and when I go down my jags of the hollowing out of the expert cadre in order to pull these things off over time and not just to shoot down a boat or even encircle a nation, you gotta have to have strong organizations that have a clear view of what's trying to be achieved and then the room that they need to come up with the path to get there, and I just don't see those conversations. I guess the last romp around the world I'll talk about is in Georgia with the South Koreans and the plant and their
Hmm.
workers getting rounded up by ICE and being sent back home. Yikes.
Yeah. Everybody's got to follow the rules, not just Latin American immigrants. South Koreans got a little loosey goosey with their visa applications, right?
It's just it's where they are, but I do think there are unintended consequences if people do we think all the rules are clear?
Oh, I don't know. I haven't gone
Yeah, I
through.
mean,
I
think
can't
about
imagine the government's rules on anything are
yeah,
clear.
right?
So, yeah.
Like, when we look at tariffs and the elimination of the de minimis tax, and now the result globally is that people aren't shipping to the United States because they don't understand the rules.
Yeah.
So, I do think that while you could take any one of these actions and come up with a reason that it makes sense from a America First perspective, but what's America trying to achieve in aggregate, and are these actions gonna give us the successes we want?
When that was a photo op, that didn't need to be as aggressive, probably as it was.
They made a promotional video about it with music. Let's say that they were loosey-goosey with their visas, and this is what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and America was very serious about its immigration policies right now. But country Z, who we're trying to encourage to come here, is gonna look and say, I don't know. Maybe I'd rather invest someplace else." So, again,
Hmm.
big old goofy
Second
world.
and third order effects.
It does remind me, and again, just military operations in general remind me, whether that's the drones in Poland or whether it's what we're doing in Venezuela, it is a dangerous world. Like, it's easy to get comfy and think that all our actions are what's going on economically, but preparedness, making sure that we're ready, making sure that our actions all make sense, matter.
Well, we'll transition from the Korean Peninsula down into the Southern Pacific and Australia, expecting to spend $1.1 billion on an Anduril undersea drone fleet. So, Australia's partnered with Anduril, announced its Ghost Shark program, which is an AI powered, uncrewed stealth submarine capable of undersea surveillance and torpedo strikes. Anduril is a U.S. defense products company, priding themselves on their ability to identify problems, privately fund R&D, and sell finished products off the shelf. Built in Australia and delivered over 5 years, the drones promise a fast, relatively low-cost option to cover roughly 1.2 million square miles of northern ocean that needs to be defended, while Australia waits on the slower AUKUS submarine timeline. So that Biden-era plan is for Australia and the UK to co-produce an attack submarine known as the SSN AUKUS, with top-secret U.S. nuclear propulsion technology, and prior to the 2040 delivery of those subs, the option to buy 5 U.S. Virginia-class submarines beginning in 2032. That agreement came under review from the Department of War in June and is still being evaluated. We've talked about NATO spending, commercial space speed, and allies carrying more of their own defense weight. Your friend, Sue, Admiral Paro, commander at U.S. Indo-PACOM, must be celebrating this move. You've seen this a lot recently, particularly in commercial space, but across companies you've partnered with, the U.S. government is slow and non-committal, but our allies are ready to make deals. Do you like this contract award, the implications for innovation, and the overall national security picture in the Indo-Pacific?
I love this award. I love the kind of revolution in domain control undersea. That has been such an area of strength and so limited to just a few nations. You see Taiwan as they see the threat of potential reunification violently.
Hmm.
You see them building an indigenous submarine just because the advantage that even one asset provides. So this idea of using newer technology, lower cost, bigger numbers, because just the Indo-Pacific, Oceania, I mean, it's huge. It's just a huge area. So I love it on the kind of revolution in military affairs approach. Your point is really good where the US government is being so slow, but the kind of world has figured out that there are capabilities, everything from indigenous intelligence capacity at the hand of commercial reconnaissance satellites to this, that they can now reasonably effect new force structures, combining technology and humans in ways they couldn't before, right? There was no way that Australia could support a force like the US can support a force. They
Hmm.
just don't have the infrastructure. But these new technologies that are more autonomous, you can now see that they can be affected within the resources they have, both human and otherwise. So I like it a lot. I like it in terms of it feels like we haven't had, with the exception of Admiral Paparo's considerable forces, much ability to influence at all what China is doing in the region. And so having Australia, who I think has some really interesting potential because they're not just adversarial with China, they are competitors and consumers, that the approach they'll have it to could turn out to be a very different approach to how they deploy these things, the missions they use for them, and then how they use warning and deterrence and de-escalation, all the things that come with it, putting actually a weapon in use. So I like it on a lot of fronts. I love the new companies that are coming in. It's funny, we talk about the deep state and installed bureaucracies. The industrial version of that are the big prime contractors, right, who have become their own
Hmm.
stodgy things and incredibly capable, and we wouldn't have the things we did without them. But the Palantirs and the Andurils and the Anthropics and the Scale AIs and Infinite, Hermeus, and you and I could go on and on about the new companies. I think this is super exciting. I think they're doing things differently. I think they're doing things faster. But I will say the only thing I offer is with many of these companies, it's still promise, not outcome. And there's a big difference between a capability and an effect. And
Hmm.
so I think there's still a bit of work to be done to say how you use this technology and integrate it into your force structure and your ops plans in order to be able to do it. And the Andrils and the new companies will figure out what it's like to work with governments, whether those are US or foreign. I will say is once you start doing this, everyone's going to do this and it changes everyone's environment. And even for the US, where we have had such control over the undersea domain, it now challenges us in ways that we haven't thought because now someone with fewer resources could now actually have an undersea force. It's awesome that it's on the side of our allies, but just remember changes change things.
Yeah. No, I think it's great. And instills competition, and then it de-risks some of that on our end because now Australia has a more pressing need for it,
They
and
do.
so they've invested in it. And if this technology works out and it becomes a good product, then it's more commercially available or available for us down the road.
I just think there's so many and it's really exciting. You said it really more eloquently than I did in terms of a lot of de-risking, a lot of new uses. We talk a lot about the capability it affords. I think it's really interesting in terms of how it changes deterrence, right?
Hmm.
How it kind of rebalances that power between big countries and little countries that has existed for so long just because of how much it costs to have any sort of standing force. And now you can be more situational and where you can respond more quickly. And I think if we thought about it in terms of deterrence as well as offensive capability, you start getting some exciting potential. But again, you got to have people there that are thinking about it, right?
Yep.
And since Australia doesn't have that as huge installed base, they're a little bit easier to revolutionize even how they imagine conducting undersea defense. I see only good.
So staying on the Indo-Pacific and the Chinese threat, we've got an Associated Press investigation that says U.S. tech has been far more central to China's surveillance apparatus than most people realized. American firms, including IBM, Microsoft, Intel, NVIDIA, Dell, Oracle, and Thermo Fisher, whose chips, cloud tools, biometrics, and analytics help power predictive policing, mass data collection, and repression in Xinjiang and Tibet, aiding repression despite mounting human rights warnings. It's important to note some firms did pull back. Thermo Fisher halted sales in Xinjiang and later in Tibet. Washington's tried to cordon off abuse, adding Chinese surveillance firms to the Commerce Entity List and blocking imports tied to forced labor under the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. But the AP shows how sales, partnerships, and indirect channels persisted for years. So the legislation that was signed in December of 2022 states that since 2017, the People's Republic of China arbitrarily detained as many as 1.8 million Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and members of the Muslim minority groups in a system of extrajudicial mass internment camps. Chinese authorities offer subsidies, incentivizing Chinese companies to open factories in close proximity to the internment camps. Local governments receive additional funds for each inmate forced to work in these sites at a fraction of minimum wage or without any compensation. The Department of State challenges stakeholders in the trade community to closely examine their supply chains to ensure their goods are not mined, produced, or manufactured wholly or in part with forced labor in the UXAR or elsewhere by entities of the UFLPA entity list. So this AP's expose highlights how commercial decisions by U.S. firms can reverberate geopolitically and ethically, and for us echoes the past episode themes on tech accountability, unintended consequences, and also human trafficking that can erode public trust. Like we've talked about, as FEMA's flood maps or AI regulation affects citizen confidence at the state and local level, this story expands the lens to global trust in U.S. firms. American companies, with or without direct intent, have fed authoritarian surveillance systems that undermine human rights. And so, Sue, who is responsible?
Who is responsible? Who is responsible? Responsibility, let it ride. Responsibility, make it mine.
I think everyone. So let's start with the U.S. government, and then we'll wrap it up at the end. But I'll take it in order. We have not, as a government, fully embraced our understanding of what to do about technologies that turn out to have national and global security implications. But because we're not involved in the production of those things like we used to be. Like it used to be that we had missile technology control regime, and we knew that the technologies involved in that were things that needed to be controlled. So we have lists, and they all made sense because it was artifacts of government programs that we knew, that we understood the risks, and so we controlled them. That is not where we are now.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see within the government structure, and I'm going to say from the intelligence community on down, the ability to identify which technologies are going to matter and then to monitor how the environment changes in terms of where the threats emerge and where the vulnerabilities exist. And we care nationally on both the security front that you talked about, but also the success of our global businesses. And so in general, the fact that we are just completely bereft in terms of any real systemic way to understand and assess the security implications of technologies before they're in evidence puts us on our heels. So that's one. You and I have talked about this a lot. You mentioned it's a theme we have, and that is we won't talk about citizens today as national security decision makers, but these companies are. They are national security decision makers and global security decision makers. I think it is interesting that some of these activities post-dated the conversations we had with Silicon Valley companies about whether they were willing to sell to the U.S. government because of how we might use their technologies for weapons or defense. And so this idea that not universally the same companies, but companies who were hesitant to sell to the government if it was going to do something that they objected to seem to have not understood that they were enabling the same outside our country. I think they're responsible for it. I think it is hard without the governmental structures to say what's the framework that we use to decide that we're not going to sell. I also think it's hard for them because by and large, they report to their shareholders and they are business people and they're selling things. And if you don't sell into China and you're in the telecommunications and computing industry, you've just cut out a huge
Huge
customer
market.
base.
Yeah.
So I think being responsible to that is important. They are, in fact, the ones that have the most power in this situation. But boy, they have an interesting tension just within their own needs. The one thing I would most wish for companies to understand is there is a difference between the United States and some of our adversaries, competitors, in terms of how they view the rule of law and how they govern themselves and what they're willing to do. Technology doesn't decide whether we cross barriers of privacy. Actually,
Right.
the rule of law does. And while we may chafe at it here, it is a pretty strong system. When you go to China or to Russia or to others, they don't have that same rule of law. And so if you're concerned about how your technology is being used, you need to engage in those questions yourself rather than assuming that there is some sort of superstructure of national security law that is going to protect misuse. And then you are going to be left holding the bag of what you allowed because you sold the technology to be used for that purpose, particularly if that technology made a difference between what could be done otherwise and what not. I want to advocate for responsibility on that front. I think we are global citizens. I think human rights abuses are just terrible, but I feel like I need to make a paid political announcement back on this rule of law thing. Um, Technology doesn't do things by itself, right? So prohibiting technologies and prohibiting technology sales based on what the technology can do is likely to be unsuccessful because that's not what puts them into use. It's the humans that put it into use. So basically, just like we argue companies about from whom you take investment dollars, I would say when you're selling things, take into account what you know about them. And then I'd love a moment of reflection by some of these companies to understand the difference of the predictable environment in which they conduct business in the United States, which may be maddening, but there is a structure to it, versus some of these people that they're willing to sell to. And then the juxtaposition of I won't sell to the government, but I will sell to China just seems silly to me. So pick your head up a little bit and realize that there are differences and that the structures that we have actually enable you to do things. What I was mostly excited about in that article, and I think this needs to be said, is what the article didn't say was that China had worried that our companies had put backdoors into their systems, allowing the United States government to be able to steal all the data that was going across and using for our purposes, because that isn't what we allow. There is that bright line between company sales and U.S. government involvement that is the obverse of what we worry with, particularly China, is that their national security law says, oh, if you use our technology, we get your data. I guess I'm feeling like one of the responsibilities is to understand the differences and be a little more appreciative of the environment that we have going on here that allows us to not be perfect, but be a little cleaner and have people, to your point, have more trust that if you buy a product, China isn't particularly worried when they buy a product from us
Hmm.
that the U.S. government's going to steal that data. No, they trust the technology that comes from a U.S. company, and there's a goodness to that. But just remember that those things are part of why we are the preferred supplier, why we are the preferred partner, and to maintain that is a good thing.
Yeah, I think the government making the rules with the real teeth. I mean, they passed the law in 2022. This has been going on for a lot longer than that. And shout out to the media on being responsible here. There was an article by Naomi Klein put out in the Rolling Stone magazine in 2008 called China's All-Seeing Eye and started highlighting some of this. I just wonder if it's an unreasonable expectation for the commercial sector to follow it all the way through, right? If you know that's what they're using this for,
Yeah.
but it's the same argument of guns don't kill people, people do. So should we hold the gun companies accountable, right? You don't know what the technology is necessarily going to be used for. And even if it's going to Tibet or going to that other state, that could be used for traffic enforcement or for any other number of social safety things. So I guess at what point does the company have to draw the line, or would you encourage them to draw the line? And then from the citizens, it's the divide between stakeholders and shareholders, right?
Right.
Stakeholders are encompassing of everybody in the national security ecosystem. Shareholders are the ones who care about the economic value.
I don't think it's reasonable for the company to by themselves feel the burden of
Yeah.
all use of every product they have. I mean, that's an insane line. I do think it is reasonable for companies to decide whether they are enabling something that is counter to our national interest. And I would argue that a company has benefit based on national interest, right? It may not feel like it because by and large, we keep this quiet going that allows them to feel like they're just business people. But the truth is, depending on what happens, you get out there. So I think reasonable questions and reasonable decisions. But again, I'm not sure I believe that technology is what's evil.
Yeah.
Right? It's more the people. I do think this is by and large a foreign policy issue, right? Where do we as a nation draw the line between our sovereign interests and you have sovereign interests being us being the watchdogs of the world and deciding what human rights are versus we go back and forth on this all along. But I think to me, the meta question is we don't really even have the insight into how this technology ecosystem is playing and evolving to even give ourselves the chance to do some a priori decision making. And so we're always caught up with, oh my God, that's now all deployed. What's interesting is we have probably provided the technology that allows China to have created a surveillance environment that doesn't allow us to operate over there clandestinely. And that has been provided by our companies. And again, so I'm going to say the meta issue is we haven't done a good job understanding how technology affects security when you didn't know the technology was going to matter.
Yep. That's why we're advocating. Yeah. And it's interesting how this last story comes together with this one. This one talks about U.S. firms enabling control and oppression. And the previous one with Australia, allied innovation, shows how trusted partnerships can foster democratic resilience. And so it's that cost of misplaced trust versus the dividends of trusted collaboration. Both circle back to this question of how do U.S. citizens, states, and companies make choices today that build or erode trust for tomorrow.
Yeah, and I love how you put that. And maybe I'm old and maybe I've worked in national security too long, but I have seen the benefit of the trust
Yeah.
that people had in us. And again, I've seen a lot, so I have seen things that we've done that has eroded that trust, true, but by and large, we were trusted partners. And for free and open societies, trust is super important, much more so than closed societies. So to me, when you assault trust, then you're making the world less safe in my definition of a world, which is free and open, free commerce, freedom of navigation, all those sorts of things. And the U.S., by being big and having this position and being largely trusted to be on the side of those things, has had great benefit to the world. And again, I'm not against at all U.S. sovereignty. We have sovereign interests. It doesn't hurt my head to say that no, the U.S. can't continue to give away resources and lose votes in the UN, right? I mean, those two things are. But as a nation, to not understand how our position of strength and trust globally has affected the freedoms and the growth that the world has experienced, and to not want to walk away from that entirely just in terms of self-interest.
And it comes down to leadership of those tech companies.
Yeah.
And speaking of the leadership and the struggles at the FBI, when the manhunt for Charlie Kirk's murderer was unfolding, FBI Director Kash Patel posted that, quote, the subject was in custody. He was not. 2 detainees were released. Utah officials said that the gunman was still at large, and the Bureau spent the next 24 hours correcting course. It's a vivid reminder that in fast-moving crises, the director's job isn't to run the play-by-play. It's to preserve trust, coordinate facts, and let the field speak. When top leaders become the narrators, errors get amplified, investigations get politicized, and public confidence erodes exactly when you need it most. DOJ policy says disclosure should be limited to incontrovertible factual matters, and the FBI's own crisis comms guide is blunt. Don't speculate, guess, or accept assumptions. The director's job is to protect the case and the Bureau's credibility. We've been shouting from our soapbox for weeks now about congressional oversight, and we're going to get a look at some this week. Director Patel will appear before the Senate Judiciary on September 16th and expected to hear questions about a purge of senior executives, his pursuit of the 2016 Russia election interference hoax, and a realignment of resources that has prioritized the fight against illegal immigration and street crime, even though the agency has for decades been defined by its work on threats like counterintelligence and public corruption. This is part of the annual hearing on oversight of the FBI. So, Sue, you've led a number of government agencies through crisis. What are your thoughts on how this was handled last week?
If they had tried to mess it up, they couldn't have done a better job. So let's talk leadership just in general for a second. And I think my reaction to almost all of the president's political appointees, he gets to choose who he wants to follow the policies that he goes. But none of these people have led anything of consequence. I think of my own leadership journey. I remember the first time I was a supervisor of 15 humans, and I was supervising people that were doing what I had known how to do. And you'd think I'd be really good at that, and I was awful at it. And I was awful at it because I didn't understand the difference between my responsibility and accountability and how you affect those things. And then I spent a career moving up in terms of leading larger and larger organizations. And as good a leader you think you are at one level, your responsibilities as a leader at the next level are so much more profound. So I think, number one, we're seeing all of these leaders' lack of leadership experience showing. And just because this is my favorite topic of all, and we don't talk enough about it, and especially in a disrupted world, leadership is the thing that's going to make the difference. Leadership really just has three big roles. Number one is you got to set a vision. What are you doing? What's this moment about? And I don't know that a warrior ethos does it for me with the Department of Defense. Maybe that does it for you, Eric. And you think that's enough to describe what we're trying to do here? Or at the FBI, we're going to go after our political enemies. Well, those enough. But it's so much bigger than that. These are huge organizations that the nation depends upon to do lots of things that are unseen. So number one are the visions. So if you were to ask me if I'm in a congressional oversight hearing, I'd start with the question, what do you think you're doing? What do you think your job is as the director of the FBI? Like, what do you think this moment demands? Where you're spending your efforts and how's that going? So that's number one. You got to set a vision. And I don't think he has it. I don't think he knows what he's doing. And I don't think he has the experience to know what he's doing. So I wouldn't hold him responsible for it, except he has the job. And so tough luck. You have it. The second thing is you've got to actually be competent and you've got to be able to affect that responsibility. And that is build an organization that can deliver on that vision. And as the person at the tippy top of a large organization, what you do is 1/10 of 1%, maybe 1/100% of all the activities they're doing every day. You aren't doing the work. You aren't the person that is delivering the good outcome. You've set a vision and then you've set the standard. Those things are super important and they're not casual. And again, so how you put people that have never done it in charge of things is really hard to do. I've done it. I've taken over organizations that I didn't know anything about. And you know what you do? You rely on your women and men, right? I trusted that if I set the vision that they would know how to deliver it. And then I'm not shirking responsibility. You're responsible for whether they carried it out or not, right? You and I talk about this. Everything that does or doesn't happen in your organization is your responsibility. But the way you do that as the leader of an organization is vision, set the standard, hold accountable. And the last thing is you don't run out there and try and prove you're the man. Because most of the things, you're just not the right person to talk about things. And I get it. We're not walking uphill in the snow, uphill both ways to work anymore like I started. And I know it's hard in a world of instantaneous communications. But even in that world, you really protect the director to be able to say things that are true and are consequential and are appropriate for their position. The biggest mistake you can make as a leader in a position is to forget that your responsibility is to the position, not to your own reputation. You get them together. So let's put Director Patel back in play here. The idea of a director communicating on his own via tweet without coordinating that with all the members that are on the team, not only does it diminish his reputation, so that the next time he speaks, are you likely to believe it? But more than that, he's now got his teammates scrambling. I mean, this was a big issue. Did Patel speaking for a day matter? As long as the special agent in charge out in Utah was able to give the briefings to the people that he needed. So just a massive mistake there. I think the second thing is if you're going to do it, and if your organization lets you go out there, you have to be good. And I just think he looked like he didn't have a clue what he was doing on this one. And again, particularly because this issue was so consequential and so many people were saying things, any word he uttered had to be in the interest of confidence and calm. I think we see this, unfortunately, in a lot of the leaders. And again, I attribute it to two things: not being particularly experienced and not understanding that the strength of their organization is not them. And that the reason people want to hear from Kash Patel is because he's Director Patel. Or the reason you want to hear from Donald Trump is because he's President Trump. And not understanding that that's the responsibility you carry. I think we're seeing the deleterious consequences right now. So I think this is a simple oversight hearing from a questioning perspective. What do you think you're doing for a living?
Mhm.
Why did you decide to do that at that moment? What lessons have you learned and what things have you put in place to make sure that doesn't happen again? And talk to us about the strength of your organization, because it sure doesn't feel like you've got the right people in place.
Yeah. Yeah. On the one hand, I kind of want to give them a little bit of grace because being so close emotionally and to that situation, because you just saw a video of your friend being shot, someone you know. But at the same time, you got to be able to detach yourself. And that's an even more reason to take a step back and not be the one announcing it. But you mentioned that you're responsible as a leader. You're responsible for everything that does or doesn't happen in your organization. And I think you touched on this a little bit already, but doesn't that mean that you should put yourself at the point of friction and lead from the front? And especially in a crisis like this, put yourself out there to make sure that the job's getting done the way you want it to, following your vision?
That's what a first line supervisor does. When I said I wasn't good at my job, I thought that everything had to be done by me according to my standards as I would do it. That actually isn't the job of a leader. Sometimes the leader is to make sure that everything's happening. You better be there. Absolutely, you're going to be in the organization. You're going to be at FBI headquarters, having people report to you constantly. You're going to be getting every 4-hour updates on what's going. But there's a big difference between fulfilling that responsibility and making the mistake of it being you. And again, there are one or two times. Let's think about bin Laden, right? Thousands of meetings held by thousands of people talking about things. And then there was one meeting, one talk that was important that the president speak. He didn't speak about the planning of the operations. He didn't speak about all the work that had gone into it or all the things he had led or gone to oversee all the work of the SEAL team as it was practicing to do things. And so this understanding of what your job is, in addition to making sure that the job is done without needing to be the person at the forefront, is really what I talk to you about when I talk about understanding your responsibility rather than of the position. And the position is what has to be preserved. And you are a renter in that position. And so how you perform in that isn't against personal preference. You choose an entirely different example. I think Jim Comey, in the events around the 2016 election, got wrapped up in his integrity. I'm Jim Comey. I have responsibility and integrity. If he had remembered that he was the director of the FBI, he would have realized the FBI could carry more weight than he could as an individual, and we might have done it. So this separation of what you would personally do and what you must do in that position, I think is something that is hard and learned. I take your point about how difficult it must have been. Kash Patel, that was just horrible. And we're not going to talk about Charlie Kirk. I think because I don't know that I have enough to say, but I will say that no matter what other problems, we have a problem with social media and that ungoverned space and things that people are just consuming it in rooms by themselves. They're just things there that no one needed to see. To your point about his emotions in that moment, I'm not advocating that people don't feel things. They will as humans. But man, when you accept the job, you've accepted the job. And it's what makes them so hard. It's why leadership is like the best and hardest thing you've ever done, because all those things have to go into play. And we could keep going down this road in terms of why I don't have a problem of a political appointee being advancing a policy. I do have a problem when that policy excludes a set of people that work for you as though if they don't believe it, if they're not aligned with that they can't work for you. I think leadership is hard and important. We've got to get better at it, right? Our leaders of these departments and agencies have to get better at it, and they have to be better prepared when they go on TV. If they're going to go on TV all the time, then don't say, I don't know, right? Or don't lie about things that are in evidence. Yeah, maybe in a modern world, leaders have to be out personally more than I would have preferred to have been for myself. But man, if you do that, you don't get to take those words back. People are counting on trusting you to stay with the theme of the episode, that whatever you say is the best you had to say that day. And you were saying it in the interests of the mission of your organization, not in the interests of anything smaller than that. I do think that emotion, compassion are all good things, and they're not antithetical with strong leadership. I think the two can exist at the same time. But I do think there are attributes that leadership has where you must be sure, you must be strong, you must be counted on, you must leap into the fray when it's necessary. You need to do that. But how you do that, right?
Yeah. It just depends on how it fits your style, right? If
Right.
that's you and that's authentically you, then that'll come out through your emotional intelligence to your people, to your troops, right?
So we started talking about it with Director Patel, and you suggested that it was a tough moment for him emotionally. I totally agree. Be emotional. Do your job.
Yeah, but you still got to do your job. Yeah.
And you're 100% right. I think one of the messages I'd give to every leader is I am not clever enough to appear to be other than who I am. Gosh, I wish I were inscrutable, Eric. I wish the world couldn't tell what I was thinking by looking at my face. But the truth is, I don't know how to be other than who I am, and so that can work for me.
Yeah.
But I don't think who I am, I can use an excuse for why I don't perform my mission. And so putting those two things together, I think and it's back on are you true or not? The truth has its own sound.
Sure.
And because the truth has its own sound, but if you hold position, that has to dominate. It's why I'm so judgy about President Trump, right? It's not that we don't have freedom of speech and he can't say the things he says, but the weight that his words
The
have
weight of the office. Yep.
is massive. And again, I don't care that he's Donald Trump. I care that he's President Trump. And so to me, that weight is the one that should dominate. And I think that's what makes leadership hard. But think about the best leaders you've ever worked for. I think they have that same attribute where you're not confused. It's not an automaton there, but they also lead well. Do you have a great leader in mind?
Yeah, a few that come to mind. And I think one of the biggest attributes that you can pull back from them is that authenticity, like you said. And some of this with Director Patel is the lack of experience. I think I don't know how many crises he's led in before or how many emotional moments like that, but many of us have trained to be able to detach ourselves from that moment because it gets hard, because you are friends with the people you work with. You become very close with, you serve on their right and their left, right? And you still got to do the job.
Yeah, I guess that's where I thought Congress failed the humans and the nation when they didn't take into account whether these leaders had the experience to lead at this level, because it's huge. I've been on the record for kind of mocking Deputy Director Bongino about saying, boy, these days are hard. And I'm like, yeah, being responsible for a nation is super hard stuff. It's big. It's harder than being responsible for a company. But you don't know what you don't know. And again, if I were to talk about what I learned in every position, I think it was an unreasonable expectation that these leaders could come in with the relatively limited leadership experience they have. And Secretary Hegseth is another example. Secretary Gabbard, again, I'm not talking about the quality of the individual. I'm just saying about, are they big enough for these jobs that are huge? And if congressional oversight doesn't take that into account, you're not serving either. To your point, Director Patel, I am quite confident wants to be great at his job. No doubt in my mind.
Yeah.
We just lost William Webster, who's one of great American patriots who was both director of the FBI and director of the CIA and just venerable and the leader we all want to be. And he gave a speech once, I guess it was right after the 2016 election, when a lot of people were concerned about whether this businessman had the acumen to be president. And I think he served 7 or 8 presidents directly. And someone in the audience asked him the question about, what's your observation about all these presidents when they come into office? He said, everyone tries to be better, right? So I'm quite confident that Director Patel wants to be great at this job. It would be nice if we had paired him with people who could bring the wisdom. So I wasn't the director of national intelligence. That was Dan Coates. He was longtime politician, member of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. He certainly understood his responsibility, but he was given a deputy that was of the community. And that should be the whoopee that allows you to understand what the organization provides and how you most affect your vision purposefully. So we set these guys up for some difficulty. I hope he gets better.
Yep.
I'm sure he wants to be.
That's right. True test of adversity is how you come up from here.
Right.
Well, we'll be watching that this week when he goes before the Senate Judiciary Committee. And then also this week, I think I'm going to watch the, you mentioned earlier about TikTok and the potential either acquisition or change in ownership of TikTok to be allowed. See that? What we're watching? TikTok? Hey-o. What are you watching, Sue?
I think I'm watching the kind of ultimatum to NATO on tariffs, whether, as I fear, this administration just isn't going to put the thumbscrews to Russia, or if NATO does find a way to strengthen its commitment, whether we then turn around and do something more. It sure hasn't gotten more peaceful there in Russia, Ukraine. And so I think I'm watching that a little bit to see, with the incursion and with this statement on tariffs, have the conditions finally been met for us to be stronger? I'm not confident, but I will be watching.
That's all right. Anything else going on?
No, big
Anything
old
else you
goofy
want us to do?
world. I think every time you and I meet, we think about what we're going to watch, and then it turns out that there's something else. It turns out
Yeah.
something else. I think Venezuela is a burbling frog
Yeah.
because it feels like we're idling, either trying to decide what to do or there are negotiations going on. I guess one more thing is, I'm not sure how long it can continue with Secretary Rubio having all the jobs he does.
Cumulative fatigue, poor guy.
Just the
There's not
fatigue.
enough water for him.
Just the fatigue,
Sorry,
and
that was
also
low.
just what I know is the whipsaw effect of him going out to represent U.S. policy, coming back home, and then the U.S. policy has changed. So I think that's hard. But the other thing is, if he's National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, and apparently having the leading voice in terms of what our defense posture is going to be, the way this works is when those actions are in tension. Right, where the National Security Advisor is saying, gang, we got to get this done. And the Defense Department says, yeah, we can only do that if it does this thing. And the State Department says, quit being idiots. We need to give diplomacy a chance. And those things in tension usually yield to good effect. If those are all being handled by one human, I think you miss that opportunity when you run the risk of aligning everything with that question of, did we come to the best shared outcome we could. So I
Yeah.
guess the other thing, Marco Rubio's action, sanity, health. But he's got to be
Yeah.
trying, man.
Are they waiting for the ability to get some of these nominees through? Trying to get the bulk votes and get some of this backlog cleaned up before they submit a national security advisor? Or who's on your short list? Who do you recommend?
I'd go outside, but someone with some experience. I'd maybe look back at a couple administrations
Yeah.
and find someone who had relevant experience but hadn't been tainted by the policies of any of the strong administrations. I just don't think we can keep on throwing away half the experience we have every time
Yeah.
we have a new election and deciding that I can't have anyone who served in a prior administration. One, to the point about experiences, those people have a whole set of lessons learned from their time and
Yeah.
probably wouldn't choose John Bolton.
No, you think he's off the list?
I think he's off.
He's probably due for another book, right? He needs some more material.
Yeah, maybe. I'd probably look for someone. This is going to sound funny, Eric. I think it's time that my generation leaders step away from the headline positions. We got a lot of, 65, 70-year-olds that are still in these things. And as much as I like to consider myself a revolutionary, I'm far away from some of the things that are currently happening. So I would love to see someone in their 50s, kind of with the new sense. It's a little bit like the Andrel thing where, it is really hard to get away from the things you believe. On all the nominees that they have for the other positions, it really is difficult to run a department if you don't have those assistant secretaries in position. They're just huge, huge chunks of your responsibility you can't affect. The problem is if you're putting people into it who aren't helping you run an actual organization, but are just one more person who believes in your policy with no wherewithal, I'm not sure it helps.
Right.
But I don't think it's a good position for us to just not consider the president's nominees. I just wish they'd do a better job of saying, yeah, no, you don't have enough, and then do their job to help force a fewer better candidates. And, Eric, there are people who will serve this. I think you have your pick of talent. Start putting some of it in.
Yep. Well, that's what we're watching. Thank you for joining us, and no doubt there's more to come. This country's strength isn't in its power, industry, or government, but in its people.
So thanks for joining us. As always, we're here for you. We love feedback. We're trying to get better every day. Listen to understandable insights anytime you can. But most importantly, go forth, do good, and for goodness sakes, be kind to one another.